There are men who die in their sleep, peacefully, with their hands folded over the blanket and an expression of quiet surrender on their faces. And then there are men who die the way General Alexei Nikolayevich Liventsev died, bolt upright in a chair, eyes locked on something no one else in a room could see, fingers gripping the armrests so tightly that the lacquer would splintered. His mouth was open. He had been trying to say something. His daughter Natasha, who was sitting across from him pouring tea, said he turned his head sharply toward the window, as though someone had called his name from outside. It was January. The window was frozen shut. There was no one in the courtyard. His last words, spoken barely 3 hours before, were not a goodbye. They were not a prayer. They were 6 words that his wife, Maria Ilyinichna, would spend the rest of her life turning over in her mind. She heard them clearly. She wrote them down that same evening, because even in grief, she was a scientist, and scientists record what they observe. 6 words, spoken in a low, steady voice, without drama, the way a man states a fact he has known for a long time. It is already too late now. Too late for what? That is the question that begins everything. Alexei Nikolayevich Liventsev was born in 1923 in the city of Voronezh, the son of a railway engineer and a schoolteacher. He was not a man inclined toward mysticism. He was not a man who burned candles or muttered prayers or visited fortune tellers or spoke of fate. He was a Soviet general, a military scientist, a man who had spent 40 years of his professional life inside the architecture of rational thought, working within systems built on the premise that the universe was a machine and that the machine, if studied carefully enough, could be understood and mastered. He believed in the periodic table. He believed in ballistics. He believed in peer-reviewed journals and reproducible experiments and the kind of truth that could be measured with instruments. He had also survived the Siege of Leningrad. This is not a small biographical detail. It is the cornerstone of everything that follows. For 900 days, from September of 1941 to January of 1944, the city of Leningrad was cut off from the rest of the Soviet Union by German forces. More than 1 million civilians died of cold, of starvation, of shelling, of exhaustion, of despair. Liventsev was 19 years old when the siege began. He was 21 when it ended. In between, he watched his father die in February of 1942, a quiet man of 53 who simply laid down one evening and did not get up again. He watched neighbors disappear. He watched children become old. He ate bread made partially from sawdust and wallpaper paste and was grateful for it. He saw things in those 900 days that would break most human beings irreparably. They did not break him, but they changed something in him, something deep and structural, the way extreme cold changes metal, making it harder and more brittle at the same time. After the war, after the army, after the decades of scientific work, Liventsev became known among colleagues as a man of unusual composure. He did not panic. He did not exaggerate. When other officers speculated or dramatized, he waited for evidence. His mentor at the Military Academy of the General Staff, a professor of strategic analysis whose name appears in declassified Soviet documents, reportedly said of him, "Liventsev is the only man I know who would ask for a second opinion before accepting that the sun had risen." This was meant as a compliment. It is important that you hold this portrait clearly in your mind, because what happens next is not the story of a mystic or a dreamer or a man prone to hallucination. What happens next is the story of a man like a steel wall and what passed through him. By the autumn of 1989, Liventsev was 66 years old and had been retired from active military service for 4 years. He and Maria lived in a 3-room apartment on Bolshaya Morskaya Street in Leningrad, the city of his youth, the city of his survival, a city he never truly left even when his career took him elsewhere. Their apartment was full of books, military history, physics, mathematics, philosophy. Maria was a neurosurgeon of considerable distinction, a woman who had spent her professional life mapping the interior landscape of the human brain. Their daughter Natasha was a physicist in Moscow. Their son Mikhail was an engineer in Minsk. They were, by every visible measure, an ordinary Soviet family of the intelligentsia, educated, secular, rational, quietly proud. In the first week of October 1989, Liventsev began having headaches. He mentioned them to Maria, who told him to rest. He rested. The headaches did not stop. On the 14th of October, a Tuesday morning, at approximately 7:45, Alexei Nikolayevich Liventsev suffered a massive hemorrhagic stroke in the left hemisphere of his brain. Maria found him on the kitchen floor. He was unconscious and non-responsive. She called the ambulance herself, speaking in a completely flat voice, giving the address, stating the symptoms, hanging up. The ambulance arrived in 12 minutes. The paramedics noted later in their report that the wife of the patient did not cry. She stood in the doorway and watched them work with the expression of a doctor watching a procedure, not a wife watching her husband die. At the hospital, the attending neurologist, Dr. Sergei Molchanov, reviewed the initial imaging and came to find Maria in the corridor. He was a careful man, a methodical communicator, not given to softening blows unnecessarily, which is to say he was very much Maria's professional peer and spoke to her accordingly. The rupture was catastrophic, he said. The affected area was large, involving regions responsible for memory, cognition, and language. The brain was experiencing severe swelling. They would put Alexei into a pharmacologically induced coma to prevent further damage. But Dr. Molchanov wanted Maria to understand clearly what the tomographic data showed. He told her that in his 22 years of practice, he had seen this pattern of injury result in a functional recovery precisely twice. He paused after saying this. Maria nodded once. She asked him to let her see the scans. For 3 days, Liventsev did not move. His vital signs were stable but flat, the way the surface of a frozen pond is stable, held in place by cold, not by health. His children came. Natasha from Moscow on the evening of the first day, Mikhail from Minsk on the morning of the second. The family gathered in a small waiting area with bad fluorescent lighting and a window that looked out onto a concrete courtyard. They drank weak tea. They spoke quietly. Natasha, who had her mother's habits, began keeping a journal of observations, times, readings, changes in the nursing staff's expressions. On the 7th day, the attending medical team held a conference. Dr. Molchanov was honest. The scans showed no improvement. The cognitive damage appeared permanent and likely to be progressive. He did not use the phrase brain dead. That is a legal and clinical designation that requires specific criteria, but the language he used, carefully worded, pointed in that direction. He spoke of meaningful recovery as an outcome that was, in his professional judgment, unlikely. He suggested the family begin considering what Alexei himself would have wanted. Maria listened, asked 3 technical questions about the imaging protocols used, thanked him, and walked back down the corridor to the chair she had placed outside her husband's room on the first day, the chair where she slept, ate, and waited. She had decided she was not leaving. This is not presented here as sentiment. It is presented as data, because what followed is inexplicable in any framework that does not account for what that woman knew. Something she had kept secret for nearly 50 years, something she had carried with the same careful composure with which she had stood in the doorway watching the paramedics work. Maria Ilyinichna Liventseva, neurosurgeon, rationalist, wife of the most empirically-minded man she had ever known, possessed of a capacity she had never once discussed publicly, never once used for personal gain, never once allowed herself to explain even to herself. That woman sat in that chair for 9 days. And on the 9th day, at 6:58 in the morning, before the nurses had begun their first round, before the corridor lights had been turned to full brightness, she heard her husband's voice from behind the closed door. Not a sound, not a groan, a voice, clear and unmistakable, saying her name, Masha. She opened the door. Alexei Nikolayevich Liventsev was lying on his back with his eyes open. Not the unfocused, reflexive opening that sometimes accompanies deep, unconscious states. His eyes were open the way a man's eyes are open when he has just been asked an interesting question and is thinking carefully about how to answer it. He turned his head toward her when she entered the room. He looked at her with complete recognition. He said, "I have to write something down. Give me paper." The nurse on duty, Zinaida, 26 years old, 3 years into her career, a young woman from Pskov who would later describe this moment in a letter to her mother with the words, "I am not going to tell you what I saw because I don't know how to say it." The nurse arrived 7 minutes later with a notepad and a pen. Dr. Molchanov was called. He came at 7:20. He stood at the end of the bed and looked at the tomographic scan clipped to the light panel on the wall, and then looked at the man in the bed who was sitting up, requesting tea, asking his wife what day it was, and apologizing for worrying the children. The damage in the scan had not changed. The brain shown in those images was not capable of what was happening in front of him. Dr. Molchanov would later write a briefcase note describing Liventsev's recovery as clinically anomalous and without satisfactory mechanistic explanation. He would use those words specifically and professionally. He was not a man who used words loosely. What he meant was simple, and it is the same thing Maria meant when she sat back down in her chair that morning and pressed both hands flat against her knees to stop them shaking. What he meant was, this should not be possible. What he meant was, the body lying in this bed should not be doing what it is doing. What he meant was the thing that no scientist, no physician, no rational mind trained in the methods of evidence and reproducibility ever wants to mean, because once you mean it, you cannot unmean it. What he meant was, something happened in that room that I cannot explain. And General Liventsev, now sitting up with a cup of tea going cold on the bedside table, and a notepad on his knee, and a pen moving across the page in a steady, angular handwriting. The handwriting of an engineer, not a poet, had already begun writing down what it was. The notepad that Liventsev asked for that morning was an ordinary one. The kind sold in any Soviet stationery shop. Gray cardboard cover, lined pages, 48 sheets. Natasha had bought a stack of them at a kiosk near the hospital entrance on the second day of waiting, thinking she might use them for her own observations. Instead, she handed one to her father, and he filled it completely within 36 hours. Then he asked for another, then another. By the end of the first week after his awakening, he had filled 7 notepads. He wrote continuously, pausing only to sleep for short intervals and to eat the food that Maria brought him from the hospital canteen. He did not speak much during this period. When a family asked him questions, he answered briefly, politely, and then returned his eyes to the page. He wrote with a focus that Maria described as not concentration, something closer to dictation, as though he were copying from something he was afraid of losing. The medical team was, to put it plainly, bewildered. Dr. Molchanov ordered a second full tomographic examination on the 3rd day after the awakening, suspecting that the initial imaging might have contained an error or that the equipment had malfunctioned in some way that produced a false picture of the damage. The second scan was performed on October 23, 1989, at 10 in the morning. Molchanov stood at the light panel for a long time afterward, the 2 scans side by side, the one from the day of admission and the one from that morning, comparing them with the careful, systematic attention of a man who genuinely does not want to believe what he is seeing. The damage was identical. The lesion in the left hemisphere had not reduced in size. The affected regions showed the same pattern of injury as before. The brain of Alexei Nikolayevich Liventsev, according to every instrument available to that hospital in October of 1989, remained the brain of a man who should not have been able to recognize his own name, let alone compose coherent, structured prose across 7 consecutive notepads. Molchanov called in a colleague, a professor of neurology from the First Leningrad Medical Institute, named Arkady Petrovich Gusev. Gusev was 61 years old, the author of 4 textbooks, a man whose professional reputation rested entirely on the precision of his diagnostic reasoning. He examined Liventsev personally, administering a standard battery of cognitive assessments. He tested orientation, memory recall, language function, arithmetic reasoning, abstract thinking. He recorded the results in neat, methodical handwriting. When he finished, he sat down across from the patient and looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "General, I want to ask you something that falls somewhat outside the standard assessment protocol, and I hope you won't take offense." Liventsev lowered his pen. "Of course," he said. Gyuzov said, "Are you aware that there is no physiological reason for you to be functioning at this level?" Liventsev considered this. Then he said, "Yes, I am aware." Gyuzov's written opinion, submitted to the hospital's medical committee 5 days later, contained a phrase that would be quoted in hushed tones among the neurology staff for years afterward. He wrote, "The patient presents with full cognitive restoration and the complete absence of structural neurological recovery. In 40 years of clinical practice, I have encountered nothing comparable. I am unable to offer a mechanism." He underlined the final sentence. Then, in a footnote that he almost certainly added after some hesitation, he wrote, "It is my personal view, stated here for the record and not as clinical conclusion, that what has occurred in this case lies outside the current explanatory capacity of the medical sciences." That footnote, in the context of Soviet academic medicine in the autumn of 1989, a world governed by rigid materialist doctrine, where any departure from approved scientific frameworks carried professional risk. That footnote was an act of considerable intellectual courage. Maria read it and said nothing. She folded the copy of the opinion she had been given, placed it in the inside pocket of her coat, and went back to her husband's room. Let us speak now about what full cognitive restoration actually meant in practical terms, because abstract clinical language can obscure the human reality beneath it. Liventsev, in the days following his awakening, demonstrated memory that was not merely intact, but sharper than it had reportedly been before the stroke. He recalled precise dates, names, coordinates, conversations from decades earlier with an accuracy that astonished his children. He recited from memory entire passages of texts he had read 40 years before. He solved mathematical problems that Natasha, a physicist, presented to him as a test, problems she had selected specifically because they required the kind of multi-step spatial reasoning most associated with the regions of the brain his imaging showed as damaged. He solved them without apparent difficulty. He solved them and then returned to his notepad. His speech was fluid, precise, and entirely without the characteristic markers of post-stroke aphasia. The searching pauses, the substituted words, the fragmented syntax that Molchanov had fully expected. When Liventsev spoke, he spoke the way he had always spoken, in complete sentences with careful word selection, at a measured pace that conveyed authority rather than limitation. There was, however, one thing different about the way he communicated in those early post-awakening days. He was, by all accounts, unusually gentle. His daughter Natasha, who had known her father as a man of warmth but also considerable severity, the severity of a person accustomed to command and to precision, noticed it immediately. It was as though something hard in him had been removed, she wrote in her journal. Not his strength, his hardness. They are not the same thing. The nursing staff noticed it too. Zinaida, the young nurse from Pskov, described him as the kindest patient I have ever had. A man who thanked each person who entered his room, who asked the orderlies about their families, who insisted on making his own bed despite the nurse's protests, who once stopped writing mid-sentence when he saw that the young intern doing his evening blood pressure check was close to tears from exhaustion, and spent 20 minutes talking to her about something, Zinaida did not know what, that left the intern walking out of the room with a steadier expression. This gentleness was not weakness. It was not the flat, affectless calm of neurological damage. It was something more deliberate, more considered, as though Liventsev had returned from wherever he had been, carrying a clear and personal understanding that time was limited and that cruelty, even in its minor daily forms, was a waste of it. On the 10th day after his awakening, a Friday afternoon in late October, when the light through the hospital window was the particular thin gray of a Leningrad autumn, Dr. Molchanov came to perform his routine check and found Liventsev not writing for the first time in days, but sitting quietly with his hands in his lap, looking out the window at the courtyard below. Molchanov completed the examination, made his notes, and was about to leave when Liventsev spoke. "Sergei Vladimirovich," he said, using the doctor's patronymic with the naturalness of a man who has always paid attention to names. "Sit down for a moment, if you have time." Molchanov sat. Liventsev looked at him. He said, "I know what your scans show. Maria told me, and I want you to understand that I am not confused about my situation. I know what those images mean. I know what should have happened to me." He paused. "What I want you to know is that what happened to me instead was not random. It was not luck, and it was not the result of any treatment you administered through no fault of your own. Something brought me back, something deliberate, and it brought me back with a specific purpose." Another pause. "I'm telling you this not because I expect you to believe me, but because you deserve to know that there is an explanation, even if it is one that does not currently fit inside your instruments." Molchanov did not respond for a long moment. Then he said, "What is the explanation?" Liventsev picked up his pen. "It is in the notepads," he said. The notepads were not immediately shared with anyone outside the immediate family. Maria kept them in a canvas bag under the hospital bed, and after Liventsev was discharged on November 7, 1989, the 72nd anniversary of the October Revolution, a coincidence that Natasha noted in her journal with a small exclamation point, she carried them home personally and placed them on the shelf above the writing desk in the room that served as Alexei's study. There were 11 of them by the time he left the hospital. 11 ordinary Soviet notepads, the gray cardboard kind, filled from the first line of the first page to the last line of the last page in Liventsev's angular, precise handwriting. Maria read them in a single night. She sat down at the desk at approximately 11 in the evening after the children had gone to bed, opened the first notepad, and did not move from that chair until 5:47 the following morning, when Alexei appeared in the doorway of the study and found her sitting with the last notepad open in her lap, looking not at the page but at the wall in front of her. She was not crying. She was doing something that was harder than crying. She was thinking. He stood in the doorway and looked at her, and she looked at him, and after a long silence she said, in a voice that was perfectly steady, "How certain are you?" He said, "Completely." She nodded once. She closed the notepad. She placed it carefully back on the shelf, in order between the 10th and the covering canvas. Then she stood up, went to the kitchen, and made tea. That morning, over the tea, Liventsev told his wife something he had not written in any of the notepads. He told her that when he was in the coma, in whatever the coma had become, in whatever space he had inhabited for those 9 days, there had been a moment when he was given a choice. Not a dramatic, thunderous choice of the kind that appears in religious texts. A quiet one. An offer, extended with complete neutrality, the way a physician presents a treatment option. You can stay, or you can return. If you return, you will carry this knowledge. You will have a limited time in which to share it. The knowledge will be difficult to convey and will not be believed by many people. The time will not be enough. These were not threats or warnings. They were simply accurate forecasts, delivered without editorial judgment. He had chosen to return. Maria set down her tea. She looked at him across the kitchen table. The kitchen table where they had eaten breakfast together for more than 30 years, in the city where he had survived a 900-day siege, and she had quietly carried a secret she could never share. And she said, "I know." 2 words, not a question, not a comfort, an acknowledgement. The acknowledgement of a woman who had sat in a chair in a hospital corridor for 9 days and not moved, because she had known, with a certainty she could not justify medically, but could not deny personally, that he was coming back, that he had something to come back for. Outside the kitchen window, the city of Leningrad was going about its morning. Trams moved along the embankment. The November sky was white and low and cold. Somewhere across the city, in the offices of institutions that classified and monitored and controlled what Soviet citizens were permitted to believe, no one yet knew that a retired general with an inexplicably healed brain was sitting at a kitchen table with 11 notepads full of information he had brought back from the other side of death. No one yet knew what those notepads contained. No one yet knew that what was written in them would, within months, begin to circulate, quietly, carefully, hand to hand, among physicians, scientists, philosophers, and ordinary people who read the pages and found that something in them resonated with a knowledge they already carried but had never had the language to name. No one yet knew any of this. But Maria knew one thing, and she had known it since the morning she opened her husband's door and found him sitting up with clear eyes, asking for paper. She knew that the 9 days were over, and that the real work was just beginning. The first person outside the family to read the notepads was not a philosopher, not a priest, not a journalist. It was a psychiatrist. His name was Viktor Semyonovich Krasnov, and he had been called in at the specific request of the hospital administration, which had grown quietly uneasy about the reports filtering out from the neurology ward. Reports of a patient who had recovered impossibly from catastrophic brain damage and who was filling notebook after notebook with what the nursing staff described, in hushed corridor conversations, as something between a scientific treatise and a confession from the other side. The administration was not concerned with the metaphysics. They were concerned with the liability. A Soviet state hospital in the autumn of 1989 could not discharge a patient who was potentially experiencing grandiose delusions as a consequence of neurological injury. The paperwork alone would be catastrophic. Krasnov was 44 years old, professionally skeptical by training and temperament, and had spent the previous decade working primarily with patients whose grip on consensus reality had loosened in various directions. Paranoid schizophrenia, acute psychotic episodes, drug-induced perceptual disorders, and the particular brand of ideation that sometimes follows traumatic brain events. He had read a great deal of case literature. He had seen men who believed they had visited God and returned with a mission. He had seen women who believed they had been selected by cosmic forces to deliver a message to humanity. He approached the Liventsev file with the precise, measured skepticism of a craftsman arriving at a job he has done many times before. He read the notepads over 2 days. What he found did not match his template. The diagnostic criteria for grandiose delusion include, among other markers, internal logical inconsistency, progressive elaboration under questioning, emotional volatility when the belief system is challenged, impaired reality testing in domains outside the delusional content, and a characteristic quality of the language itself, expansive, pressured, frequently metaphorical in ways that obscure rather than illuminate. Krasnov found none of these. What he found was the opposite. The notepads were written in the language of a military scientist, spare, sequential, numbered where numbering aided clarity, with marginal annotations that revised earlier statements where Liventsev had, upon reflection, concluded that a word or phrase was imprecise. The margins of the 7th notepad, for example, contained a series of bracketed corrections in which Liventsev had returned to passages written earlier and crossed out words he considered emotionally loaded, replacing them with more neutral formulations. This was not the behavior of a man in the grip of delusional ideation. This was the behavior of a man trying very hard to be accurate about something that resisted the instruments of accuracy he had spent his life developing. Krasnov asked to meet the patient. Liventsev agreed. They spoke for 3 hours on a Wednesday morning in late October. Krasnov asked every question in his professional repertoire and several that were not. He challenged the account directly at multiple points, presenting the most parsimonious explanations. Hypoxic hallucination, vivid confabulation produced by a damaged but recovering brain filling gaps with generated content. The well-documented tendency of near-death neurological events to produce experiences that feel more real than waking reality precisely because they are generated by a brain operating under extreme physiological stress. Liventsev listened to each challenge with complete attention. He did not become defensive. He did not dismiss the objections. He said, in response to the hypoxic hallucination hypothesis, "You may be right. I have no way to definitively exclude that interpretation from the outside. What I can tell you is that from the inside, the distinction between that experience and every other experience I have had in 66 years was not a matter of vividness. It was a matter of category. I have had vivid dreams. I know what they are. This was not in that category." He paused. "But I want you to know that I have written nothing in those notepads that I cannot defend to a skeptical reader, including you. I would prefer you to find the holes." Krasnov wrote in his clinical assessment, "The patient presents with no evidence of thought disorder, loosening of associations, persecutory ideation, or impaired reality testing. His account of the experiences during his comatose period is internally consistent, structurally coherent, and delivered with the epistemological modesty of a trained researcher rather than the certainty characteristic of delusional conviction. I am not in a position to validate the content of his experiences, which lie outside the scope of psychiatric assessment. I am in a position to state that this patient does not meet diagnostic criteria for any psychotic disorder, and that his discharge on medical grounds is appropriate." The administration read the report. They discharged Liventsev. But Krasnov did something else, something that was not in his report and not in his professional capacity. He went home that evening, sat at his own desk, and spent 4 hours writing personal notes about what Liventsev had told him during those 3 hours of conversation. Not clinical notes, personal ones, notes that he would keep in a private folder for the remaining 23 years of his life. And that would be found by his daughter after his death in 2012 inside a copy of William James's Varieties of Religious Experience that he had clearly been reading and rereading. The margins were dense with penciled annotations. The notes began with a single sentence that Krasnov had underlined 3 times. This man is not confused about what happened to him. So what had happened to him? What did Liventsev actually write in those 11 notepads? What did the brain of a Soviet general, lying in a pharmacological coma in a Leningrad hospital in October of 1989, encounter in the space between clinical death and inexplicable return? He wrote that the transition was not what he had expected, though he acknowledged he had not, as a committed materialist, expected anything at all, which meant that expectation played no role in shaping what occurred. He had not expected a tunnel. He had not expected light. He had not expected the figures of deceased relatives extending welcoming hands from a warm distance. What he experienced instead was, in his own language, a cessation of the requirement for location. He wrote this phrase and then bracketed it with the annotation, "I am aware this is grammatically strange. I cannot find a better formulation." What he meant, what he spent several subsequent pages attempting to clarify, was that his awareness continued, but the fundamental structure that normally organizes awareness, namely the assumption that one exists at a particular point in space relative to other points, simply ceased to apply. He was not somewhere else. He was not nowhere. The concept of somewhere had temporarily suspended its relevance. He described his consciousness in this state as undamaged and fully operational, more fully operational in certain respects than during ordinary waking life. He noted specifically that his thinking was not sequential in the way that human thought normally proceeds, one thought following another in a chain, each dependent on the previous. Instead, he wrote, multiple complete lines of reasoning appeared to be available simultaneously, without competition, without the cognitive bottleneck that ordinarily forces the mind to process one thing at a time. He wrote, I understood, in that state, why mathematics seemed obvious to certain minds that we call genius, is not that those minds are structurally different. It is that they have, for reasons I cannot fully explain, partial access to this mode of processing within ordinary life. What those individuals call intuition is something more specific than that word implies. He wrote about silence, not the silence of a quiet room, which is still threaded through with the low hum of one's own blood, the distant pressure of ambient sound. A different order of silence, one that was not the absence of noise, but a presence in its own right. He struggled with this passage more than any other in the notepads. He crossed out and rewrote it 6 times. The final version read, "The silence I am attempting to describe is not negative. It does not feel like deprivation. It feels like the condition prior to all conditions. The way that the space inside a cup is the condition that makes the cup useful, not the absence of something it should contain." And then there was the encounter. Liventsev was precise and consistent about this across all 11 notepads, across the conversation with Krasnov, and across every subsequent account he gave in the years that followed. He did not call it a being, because that word implies a form, and there was no form. He did not call it a voice, because that word implies sound, and there was no sound. He settled, after considerable deliberation, on the word presence, while noting in a margin that this word was inadequate, and that its inadequacy was not a failure of his vocabulary, but a genuine structural limitation of human language applied to an experience that human language was not built to accommodate. What he could say about the presence was this: it was ancient, not ancient in the way that a mountain is ancient, aged, worn, geologically accumulated, but ancient in the way that a mathematical axiom is ancient, prior to time rather than merely predating things within time. It was the oldest thing he had ever encountered, and encountering it produced in him not the awe that humans typically describe when confronted with great age or power, but something quieter and more disorienting. He wrote, "I felt recognized, not welcomed, not judged, not examined. Recognized, the way one recognizes a face one has always known but never consciously noticed. The presence saw him completely." This was the phrase he used repeatedly and insisted upon when Krasnov pushed back on it. Not understood him, not read him, saw him. Every choice he had made since the first moment of his conscious life was present and visible, not laid out sequentially like a file for review, but held simultaneously the way all the colors of a painting are visible at once when you step back far enough. Every kindness, every failure, every moment of cowardice dressed as prudence, every moment of real courage that no one had witnessed. The year in Leningrad when he had given his own ration to a woman with 2 children and told no one, not even Maria. The time in 1957 when he had declined to sign a report that he knew was falsified and had borne the professional consequences quietly. The morning in 1973 when he had been sharp with his son Mikhail over something trivial and had known immediately that he was wrong and had not apologized until 3 days later, which was 3 days too long. All of it, present and visible, held without judgment. This was the element of Liventsev's account that most affected Krasnov, and later, most affected the people who read the notepads. Not the cosmological architecture, not the metaphysics of consciousness, the absence of judgment. Liventsev wrote about it at length and from multiple angles, returning to it the way a man returns to a stone in his shoe, because it troubled him philosophically. He had been raised in a culture of moral accounting, where actions were evaluated, weighed, rewarded, and punished by the state, by history, by ideology, and in the older Russian tradition that persisted beneath the Soviet surface like an underground river, by God. The entire architecture of human moral culture, across every civilization he had studied, was built on the premise that deeds have consequences imposed from outside, that there is a ledger somewhere and a hand that holds the pen. What he encountered contained nothing resembling this structure. The visibility of his life's record did not produce consequence. It produced something he found far harder to describe and far more demanding to integrate: clarity. Not punishment, not absolution, just sight. The full, unmediated sight of what he had actually been, which was, as it is for every human being he had ever known, a mixture, damage and grace in the same container. And the presence held this mixture without flinching, without revising it, without requiring it to be other than what it was. He wrote, "I understood, in that moment, why the absence of judgment was more difficult to bear than judgment would have been. Judgment gives you something to argue with. Clarity gives you nothing to argue with. It simply is, and you must stand in it." The presence communicated, not in language. He was emphatic about this, correcting himself in several places where he had initially used the word said and replacing it with conveyed or made known. What was conveyed to him in this state of complete visibility and ancient silence was not a theology. It was not a set of instructions. It was not a reward or a prophecy in any conventional sense. It was, he wrote, closer to a restoration of knowledge that was always available but had been buried under the accumulated weight of daily survival. As though the coma had not introduced new information, but had removed the interference that prevented him from accessing information already present. He used the analogy of a radio signal that exists continuously, but can only be received when the static is removed. The static, he wrote, was not ignorance. It was the particular kind of noise generated by a human mind that is perpetually managing its own fear of what it might find if it looked too directly at certain questions. The presence showed him things. Specifically, it conveyed to him the architecture of what happens after the body stops, not as revelation, but as orientation. The way a guide might orient a traveler not to awe them, but to prepare them for a journey. And what Liventsev was shown, what he spent the remaining years of his life attempting to translate into the inadequate container of human language, was a map, not a comforting map, not a terrifying one, a precise one, the kind drawn by a cartographer who has no interest in making the territory look better or worse than it is, but only in making it navigable. And it was this map, its structure, its logic, its implications, that he carried back with him when the presence offered him the choice and he chose, with full knowledge of the cost, to return. He wrote, at the bottom of the final page of the third notepad, in handwriting slightly larger than the rest, as though he wanted to make sure it could be read clearly, "What I was shown is not meant to frighten you. It is meant to prepare you. These are not the same thing. Fear paralyzes. Preparation gives you time to act. And time, as I now understand better than I did before, is the one resource that cannot be recovered once it has been spent." Liventsev did not use the word afterlife. He was deliberate about this from the very first page of the fourth notepad, where he addressed the terminology directly before proceeding to the substance. He wrote, "I am aware that what I am about to describe will be immediately categorized by most readers as a religious or spiritualist account, and that this categorization will, for a significant portion of those readers, serve as a reason to stop reading. I ask only that the categorization be suspended for long enough to examine the structure of what is described. Religious accounts are typically received on faith. What I am presenting was received through direct observation under conditions that, while unusual, were not voluntary, and which I would not have chosen as a method of investigation had any alternative been available. I'm a scientist. I prefer control conditions. I had none. What I have instead is precision of recollection, and I will use it. The architecture he described was not a hierarchy in the religious sense, not a graduated series of rewards and punishments arranged vertically from deepest suffering to highest bliss, with a divine administrator at the apex making allocations based on a ledger of earthly behavior. It was more functional than that, more mechanical. The word he reached for, and used with some hesitation given its contemporary connotations, was structure. What he had been shown was a structure, three distinct conditions of post-physical existence, not assigned by external judgment, but entered according to the specific quality of what he called the accumulated resonance of a consciousness. He explained this phrase carefully. By accumulated resonance, he meant something analogous to what physicists mean when they speak of the state of a system. Not a moral evaluation, but a measurable configuration. The condition a consciousness enters after physical death is determined not by whether it was good or bad in the terms that human moral systems use, but by what it had become. The distinction, he wrote, was crucial. A verdict is imposed from outside. A state is what you are. The first condition he described, he named the orbit. He wrote about it at greater length than the other two, and with more evident discomfort, returning to it across multiple notepads with the persistent attention of a man who cannot quite finish with a subject because the subject has not quite finished with him. The orbit was not, he was careful to clarify, a place of punishment in any administered sense. There was no punishing authority. There was no pain inflicted from outside. What there was a confrontation, total, unmediated, and inescapable, with the specific quality of harm that a consciousness had generated during its physical existence. Not an abstract moral reckoning, but an experiential one. What this meant, in the terms Liventsev used, was that the consciousness in the orbit did not merely understand intellectually that it had caused pain to another person. It experienced that pain from the inside, from the position of the person who had received it, with the full fidelity of the original event, and without the psychological distance that had, during physical life, allowed the harm to be rationalized, minimized, or forgotten. He wrote, "Imagine that every unkindness you have ever committed, every word spoken in contempt, every silence that was chosen over truth, every moment when you saw another person's need and turned away from it because the cost of responding was inconvenient. Imagine that each of these is not remembered, but re-inhabited, not as memory, which carries a built-in softening, a narrative distance, the mercy of time, but as present experience, with complete sensory and emotional fidelity from the position of the person who received it. This is not punishment. This is accuracy. The orbit is what accuracy feels like when there is no longer any mechanism available to protect you from it." He was asked by Krasnov during their conversation whether this description was not functionally identical to what religious traditions call hell. He sat with the question for a moment and then said, "The difference is this. Hell, in most traditions, is permanent and administered. What was shown is neither. It is temporary in the precise sense that it concludes when the process it serves has concluded, when the consciousness has fully integrated, fully inhabited, fully understood every harm it generated, and has arrived through that process at a state of genuine comprehension rather than merely intellectual acknowledgement. And it is not administered. No one decides when it ends. The consciousness itself, through the quality of its engagement with the process, determines its own duration." He paused. For some, this will be brief. For others, it will be what feels like an immeasurable span. And for a very small number, those whose capacity for genuine recognition has been so thoroughly suppressed during physical life that it cannot be restored even through this process. There's what I can only describe as a second dissolution. Not annihilation, a return to an undifferentiated state, the way a wave returns to water. The individual pattern ceases. The energy remains. He wrote about the orbit for 47 pages across 3 notepads. Then he turned to the second condition. He named it the House of Clarity. The name was his own, translated from the Russian he had used in the notepads, and he acknowledged its limitations. It sounded, he wrote in a parenthetical, like the title of a self-help book, which was unfortunate because what it designated was neither comforting nor instructional in the way that phrase implied. What it was a state of consciousness that had emerged from physical life without the specific accumulation of unresolved harm that defined the orbit's inhabitants, not because it had been perfect, but because it had been, in its fundamental orientation, honest. Honesty was the operative quality, not goodness in the conventional sense, not religious observance, not achievement or virtue as socially defined. Honesty with oneself, with others, with the reality of one's own limitations and the reality of other people's interiority. Liventsev wrote, "The consciousness that enters this state is not one that has never caused harm. Every human life causes harm. It is the consciousness that, having caused harm, did not look away from that fact, that did not construct elaborate explanatory architectures to make the harm someone else's responsibility, that faced what it had done with a willingness to carry it, and carried it honestly without using the weight of it as a reason to stop trying. The House of Clarity was not rest in the sense of inactivity. It was rest in the sense that an instrument is at rest when it is precisely calibrated, not passive, but aligned. The consciousness in this state was, he wrote, fully aware of everything it had been during physical life, including all its failures, but held this awareness without the distortion of guilt. Guilt, he explained, was a human construct designed for a world in which time moves forward and behavior can be modified. In a state where physical time no longer operates, guilt serves no function and generates only noise. What replaced it was something he struggled to name, eventually settling on the phrase compassionate accounting, a complete and clear-eyed view of one's own life held within a framework that understood the conditions under which that life had been lived. The pressures, the inheritances, the fears, the specific historical and biological circumstances that had shaped every choice, not as excuses, as context, the difference between judgment and understanding. He wrote, "In this state, a consciousness sees itself the way a good doctor sees a patient, completely, without minimizing and without catastrophizing, with full knowledge of the damage and full appreciation of the resilience, with the understanding that the two are not in opposition, but are aspects of the same system." The third condition was the one that caused Liventsev the most difficulty to describe, and the one that he believed would be most challenging for a scientifically trained reader to receive without either dismissing it or, worse, distorting it into a framework it did not fit. He named it the memory field, and immediately noted that this name was the most inadequate of the three, because the thing it designated was not a field in any physical sense, and was not merely memory in any psychological sense. It was, he wrote, the substrate, the foundational layer beneath both of the other conditions and beneath physical existence itself, the structure within which all experience, at every level, was embedded and preserved. He approached it through an analogy. In 1989, quantum physics had not yet produced the theoretical frameworks that would later make certain aspects of his description seem less alien to scientific readers. The concepts of quantum information theory, the holographic principle, the theoretical work on consciousness as a fundamental rather than emergent property of the universe were either nascent or not yet articulated. Liventsev was working, as he acknowledged, at the edge of available language. He wrote, "Imagine that every experience that has ever occurred, every moment of consciousness, every event, every interaction between any two entities in the history of this universe, is not merely a sequence of states that each replace the preceding state, as classical physics implies, but is instead preserved in some form in the total informational structure of what exists, not accessible under normal conditions, not retrievable the way a memory is retrieved, but present, the way a melody is present in the instrument even when no one is playing it. The memory field is this structure. It is the universe's record of itself." He wrote about the implications of this carefully. If the memory field was real, if experience was genuinely preserved rather than merely succeeded, then what died with the body was not consciousness, but only the particular biological interface through which that consciousness had operated during a specific physical episode. The consciousness itself, as a pattern of organized information, did not disappear. It rejoined a larger informational structure from which it had never been fully separated, only temporarily and partially individuated. He wrote, "We think of death as loss because we understand ourselves as things. If we understood ourselves correctly, as processes, as patterns of organized information that persist across substrates, the question would not be whether consciousness survives, but what form its continuation takes and what determines that form," which is precisely what I have been attempting to describe. And then he wrote about the conductor. The conductor was Liventsev's name for the mechanism by which the memory field communicated with living consciousness during physical life. Not through religious experience, not through dreams alone, not through the dramatic visionary states reported by mystics across traditions. Though all of these, he suggested, were forms of the same contact operating at different intensities under different conditions. The conductor's primary channel was something far more ordinary, far more universal, and far more systematically ignored. He called it by its common name, intuition. But what he meant by intuition was not a vague emotional response or a hunch formed from pattern recognition below the threshold of conscious analysis, which is the conventional scientific account of the phenomenon. What he meant was a direct, low-bandwidth signal from the memory field, a transmission containing information that the individual consciousness could not have derived from its own experience or reasoning, arriving not through the analytical mind, but through something prior to analysis, through the body, through the gut, through the sudden, inexplicable certainty that a particular direction is correct or a particular choice is wrong, arriving without argument, without evidence, without any of the apparatus of rational justification. He wrote, "I want to be precise about what I am claiming here, because imprecision would undermine the point. I am not claiming that every strong feeling is a message from a cosmic database. I am claiming something narrower and more specific, that the class of experiences characterized by a sudden, unprompted, pre-analytical certainty that cannot be accounted for by the available evidence, and that, when followed, proves correct in ways that the analytical mind could not have predicted, constitutes genuine information transmission rather than pattern recognition, coincidence, or psychological noise. The difference is detectable. It has a quality that is distinct from ordinary feeling. Those who have experienced it know the distinction I am drawing." He paused in the writing, as evidenced by a slight change in the pressure of the pen on the page at this point. Natasha noted it years later when she had the notepads examined by a handwriting analyst. Then he continued, "Mendeleev saw the periodic table in a dream. Tesla described his most important insights as arriving fully formed from outside the normal process of reasoning, in states of unusual clarity. Edison spoke of accessing what he called the world's memory. These men were not mystics. They were engineers and scientists operating at the limits of human knowledge. What they were accessing, I would argue, was the conductor, a signal from the memory field that is available to all human consciousness, but is audible only when the ordinary noise of the analytical mind is sufficiently reduced." He returned, at the end of his description of the three conditions, to the question of what the architecture meant for the way a person should live. He did not phrase this as a moral instruction. He phrased it as an engineering problem, given what he now understood about the structure of post-physical existence. Given that what a consciousness enters after death is not determined by external judgment, but by what it has become, by the specific quality of its accumulated resonance. The question for a living human being was not, how do I behave well enough to earn a favorable verdict? The question was, what am I becoming? And is that what I want to be? The distinction, he wrote, was not semantic. Behavior shaped by the fear of external judgment produced a specific kind of person, one whose actions were fundamentally performative, oriented toward an observer, essentially reactive. Behavior shaped by the question of what one was becoming produced something different. A person who acted as consistently as human limitation allowed from the inside out. Not perfectly, not without failure, but from a genuine orientation toward the question, rather than an anxious monitoring of the answer. He wrote the last paragraph of this section of the notepads in the hospital, on the evening before his discharge, while the corridor outside his room had gone quiet, and the November dark had settled over the courtyard, and Maria had fallen asleep in the chair beside his bed for the first time in 9 days. He wrote, "I did not expect to be believed. I expect to be doubted, dismissed, and, by some, ridiculed. I am 66 years old. I have survived the Siege of Leningrad, and I have recently experienced a stroke that should have ended my capacity for coherent thought. My credibility as a witness is, in a conventional sense, severely compromised. I accept this. What I ask is only that the architecture I have described be examined on its own terms, not as testimony to be believed or disbelieved, but as a structure to be tested against experience. Ask yourself whether the 3 conditions I have described correspond to anything you already know privately about how human beings are shaped by what they do and do not face in themselves. Ask whether the memory field I have described explains anything that the model of consciousness as a purely biological phenomenon leaves unexplained. Ask whether the quality of signal I have called the conductor is familiar to you from your own life. And if it is, if any of this resonates with a knowledge you already carry but have had no framework for, then ask yourself what that resonance is, where it comes from, what it might mean." He set down the pen. He looked at Maria, sleeping in the chair. He looked at his hands, the hands of a 66-year-old man, the hands of a soldier and a scientist and a survivor, and he held them still in his lap for a long time in the dark. Then he closed the notepad, and he rested. There's a particular kind of loneliness that belongs exclusively to people who know things they cannot explain. Not the loneliness of isolation, of being physically alone, cut off from community or warmth. A different kind. The loneliness of standing in a room full of people who are discussing the weather while you are holding, quietly and without display, the knowledge that the house is on fire. Maria Nikolayevich had lived inside that specific loneliness for 49 years before her husband came back from the other side of death and began writing it all down. For 49 years she had carried, in the same capable hands that perform neurosurgery on the most complex organ in the human body, a capacity that the world she moved in, Soviet, secular, scientific, rigorously materialist, had no category for and no tolerance of. She had carried it the way certain people carry a physical deformity that can be concealed by clothing. Always present, occasionally visible in unguarded moments, requiring constant low-level management so that it never became the thing that defined her in the eyes of people whose respect she needed in order to do her work. She had first understood that she was different when she was 7 years old, in the spring of 1942, in the city of Leningrad, in the middle of the siege. Her mother had sent her to fetch water from the communal tap at the end of the street. A distance of approximately 140 meters, a journey that in any other city, in any other year, would have been a trivial errand for a child of 7. But in Leningrad in the spring of 1942 was a meaningful act of survival requiring attention and physical effort. Maria walked to the tap. She filled the container. She turned to walk back, and then she stopped. She could not explain, afterward or ever, precisely what she experienced in that moment. It was not a vision. It was not a voice. It was a certainty that arrived with the completeness and the weight of a physical object. The knowledge that she must not walk back by the same route she had taken to reach the tap. That she must go around. That something was about to happen on the direct path that she needed not to be present for. She went around. She reached the apartment building by the longer route and climbed the stairs and gave her mother the water and sat down. 40 minutes later, a shell struck the corner of the building on the direct route, at the precise spot she would have been passing had she walked back the way she came. She told her mother. Her mother looked at her for a long moment, then told her never to speak of it again to anyone. Her mother was not a cruel woman. She was a frightened one. In the Leningrad of 1942, There were things that could get a family classified as socially dangerous. And a child who claimed supernatural foreknowledge was precisely such a thing. Maria understood this even at 7. She filed the instruction away alongside the event itself and began the long practice of silence. Over the following decades, the capacity developed with a consistency that she found, as a scientist, almost irritatingly systematic. It was not dramatic. It did not arrive in thunder and lightning and prophetic declarations. It arrived in the margins of ordinary life, a sudden clarity about a patient's prognosis that preceded rather than followed the diagnostic data, an inexplicable unease about a specific route or appointment that, when heeded, proved justified, a knowledge of what a person in front of her was feeling that went beyond the observable evidence of their expression and posture and body language, into something she could only call direct contact with their interior state. She saw, in her own language she used only privately, never professionally, what she referred to as the field. Not an aura in the popularized chromatic sense, a quality of presence, a texture, something that surrounded and emanated from living people and that carried information she had no conventional means of accessing. Some fields were clear, some were turbulent, some had shadows in them that corresponded, with a regularity she had tracked carefully over years of private observation, to specific physical conditions in the person who carried them. 3 times in her surgical career, she had redirected a procedure based on nothing she could formally justify, overriding the available clinical data on the basis of what the field was showing her. And 3 times she had been correct in ways that her colleagues attributed variously to exceptional intuition, clinical experience, and, on one occasion, luck. She never corrected any of these interpretations. She had, however, allowed herself one conversation on the subject. One person, in 49 years of silence, to whom she had spoken honestly about what she carried. Her name was Elena Vasilievna Sorokina, and Maria had met her in 1967 at a medical conference in Moscow, a neurologist from Leningrad like herself, a quiet woman of 40 with sharp, careful eyes and the particular quality of stillness that Maria had come to recognize as a marker of people who were managing a large internal experience. They had been placed at the same dinner table. The conference dinner had been dull, the food worse, and at some point in the evening, through a sequence of small conversational movements that neither of them entirely initiated, they had arrived at a territory of honesty that both of them recognized immediately as unusual and unlikely to be revisited. Elena had looked at Maria across the table with those careful eyes and said, in a voice pitched below the surrounding conversation, "You see it too, don't you?" It was not a question. What followed was a friendship of 21 years, conducted almost entirely through letters, careful letters, written in the particular compressed language that people use when they're communicating something real through a medium they suspect may be read by other eyes. Maria kept every letter. She kept them in a wooden box, tied with a piece of string, inside the wardrobe in the bedroom, behind a row of winter coats. She showed them to no one until after Alexei came back from the hospital, and even then she showed them only to Natasha. Elena Vasilievna Sorokina had lived a different version of the same story, and it had cost her more. Where Maria had been armored by temperament and protected by marriage to a man whose public rationalism provided a kind of social camouflage, Elena had been more exposed. She was unmarried. She was, by the accounts of people who knew her, less skilled at the particular performance of normalcy that Soviet professional life required. She had a directness about her, an inability or unwillingness to fully conceal what she was seeing that expressed itself in small ways. A slight hesitation before speaking to someone that the person later identified as having felt like being read, a comment about a colleague's health that proved accurate before any clinical evidence was available. A quality in her physical presence that made some people deeply comfortable and others deeply uneasy. The people it made uneasy were the ones with institutional power. In 1971, a complaint was filed against Elena by a senior colleague at the institute where she worked, a man she had, according to the account Elena gave Maria in a letter dated March of that year, declined to validate in a small but professionally significant way. The complaint was couched in clinical language. Concerns about Dr. Sorokina's judgment, questions about her methodology, references to unscientific reasoning in her case notes. The specific incident cited was a diagnosis Elena had made of a patient whose presenting symptoms were ambiguous, but whose field, as Elena had privately assessed it, was carrying what she described to Maria as the texture of a major systemic failure approximately 3 months in advance of its clinical expression. She had noted in the patient's file, with a restraint she clearly considered a concession to institutional reality, that she recommended follow-up examination at 3-month intervals despite the currently normal blood work. 3 months later, the patient was hospitalized with a condition that, caught when Elena first assessed it, would have been straightforwardly treatable. The colleague's complaint focused not on this outcome, which vindicated Elena entirely, but on the reasoning that had led to the recommendation, which the colleague characterized as non-evidence-based and potentially indicative of impaired clinical judgment. Elena was placed under review. The review cleared her professionally, but left a mark. She was passed over for a promotion she had earned. She was moved to a less prominent position. The institutional temperature around her dropped by several degrees and did not recover. She continued to practice, continued to write to Maria, continued to see what she saw, and to manage it with diminishing success as the years accumulated. In the early 1980s, her letters changed in quality. They became shorter, more fragmented. The careful, compressed language she had always used gave way to something less controlled. Not incoherence, but a kind of tiredness that was deeper than physical fatigue. She wrote, in a letter dated November of 1983, a single paragraph that Maria had underlined in pencil. I think the problem is not the seeing. I have learned, mostly, to carry the seeing. The problem is the not telling. Every conversation I have with another human being is a conversation in which I am present with more information about that person than I am permitted to use. This is not a gift. It is a form of imprisonment. You know what I mean. Maria knew what she meant. Elena Vasilievna Sorokina died in June of 1988. She was 43 years old. The official cause of death was cardiac failure, which her physician attributed to chronic stress and what the post-mortem notes described as generalized physical depletion. Maria received the news by telephone and sat for a long time afterward in the kitchen of the Bolshaya Morskaya apartment, not crying, doing the thing that was harder than crying. She thought about the 21 years of letters in the wooden box behind the winter coats. She thought about the dinner table in Moscow in 1967 and the careful eyes and the 4 words spoken below the surrounding noise. You see it too. She thought about what it meant that a woman of exceptional intelligence and genuine capacity had been consumed, not by her gift, but by the conditions the world imposed on that gift. The silence, the concealment, the accumulated weight of a life lived in permanent translation between what was actually known and what was socially permissible to know. She thought about this for a long time, and then she got up and made dinner. After Alexei came home from the hospital, after she had read the notepads and sat in the study until nearly 6 in the morning thinking about what she had read, after the conversation over tea, in which her husband told her about the choice he had been offered, and she had said, I know, after all of this, Maria did something she had not done in 49 years. She told the truth. Not publicly, not yet, not in the careful, compressed language of letters to a single trusted correspondent. She told it directly to Alexei, sitting across from him at the kitchen table with the morning light coming through the window over the courtyard, speaking in a plain voice with no performance of difficulty or drama. She told him everything. The water tap in 1942, the field and what it showed her, Elena's letters and Elena's death. The 49 years of silence and what that silence had required. The 3 surgeries in which she had followed what she knew against what the instruments showed and been right each time and said nothing meaningful about why. All of it. Alexei listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Why didn't you tell me?" She looked at him. She said, "Because you were the most rational person I knew, and I needed you to stay that way. Your rationality protected us both." Another silence. Then he said, "Did it work?" And she almost smiled. She said, "Mostly." This conversation and the understanding it produced fundamentally shaped the form in which Liventsev's account was eventually shared with the world beyond the family. Maria became not merely a witness to her husband's experience, but a co-narrator of the larger story. The story of what it costs to carry knowledge that the world is not yet prepared to hold. She brought to that narrative something that Liventsev's own account, with its scientific precision and methodical structure, could not have provided alone: the human evidence. The evidence of a life lived inside the question, not arrived at it through a single catastrophic event. Where Alexei had crossed the boundary between the known and the unknown in 9 days of medical crisis, Maria had spent 49 years navigating the territory between them through small, daily, unremarked acts of perception and concealment. She also brought a warning. In the conversations that followed her disclosure, conversations that ranged across weeks and touched on every aspect of what Alexei had written and what Maria had observed across her lifetime, she articulated something that became one of the most frequently quoted passages from the account as it eventually circulated. She said, "The capacity I am describing, whatever it is, whatever its mechanism, does not belong to the person who carries it. It passes through them the way water passes through a channel. The channel does not own the water. The moment a person with this capacity begins to use it as a possession, to sell it, to build authority with it, to place themselves above other people on the basis of it, the transmission stops. I have seen this happen. I watched it happen slowly to 3 people I knew with similar capacities. The moment the gift becomes a currency, it becomes a counterfeit. What remains looks the same from the outside, but carries nothing real." She paused. Elena never made that error. She was destroyed by the world's response to her gift, not by any corruption of it. That is a different kind of tragedy, and in some ways a harder one to witness, because it was entirely unnecessary. There was a 4th person Maria spoke of briefly in a conversation recorded by Natasha in her journal in early December of 1989. A woman she had encountered once in the late 1970s at a gathering of physicians in Leningrad that had touched, informally and cautiously, on questions of perception and consciousness that lay outside the official scientific framework. This woman had demonstrated, in the course of an evening, several perceptions that were verifiable and unexplained. She had been calm, specific, and apparently entirely without ego about what she was doing. She had described the experience of the capacity in language that corresponded almost exactly to Maria's own private experience of it. The feel, the texture, the information that arrived from outside the analytical process. Maria had approached her afterward, and they had spoken briefly. The woman had said one thing that Maria remembered with complete precision. Word for word, 20 years later, she had said, "The hardest thing is not the seeing. The hardest thing is learning to be still inside it. Because if you're frightened of what you see or excited by it or proud of it, any of those things, the seeing distorts. It bends toward what you feel rather than toward what is. Stillness is the only accurate position." She had smiled then, a small, unremarkable smile, and said, "It took me 30 years to learn that. I hope it takes you less." Maria had never seen her again. She did not know her name. She told Natasha this story and then sat quietly for a moment. Natasha asked her what it meant in the context of everything they were now living through. The notepads, the impossible recovery, the architecture of what came after that her father had spent weeks attempting to translate into language. Maria thought about it. She thought about Elena, dead at 43 from the weight of what she had known and could not speak. She thought about the woman at the gathering and the 30 years of learning stillness. She thought about her own 49 years of silence, and whether silence was a form of stillness or merely a performance of it, and whether the distinction mattered. She thought about the wooden box behind the winter coats and the letters tied with string and all the things that had been known and carried and never said in this apartment, in this city, in this country, by people who were trying to do their work honestly in a world that had very firm views about what kind of knowledge was permissible. Then she said, "It means that the knowledge is real, and that the world is not yet ready for it, and that the space between those two facts is where human beings live, and where they either become more than they were or less." She stood up from the table. She looked at her daughter, who was 31 years old and a physicist, and had her father's eyes and her mother's hands. "Your father came back," she said, "to try to close that space a little. I don't know if it will work. I don't know how much time we have." She picked up the cup that was empty and carried it to the kitchen sink. Outside the window, Leningrad was doing what it always did in December, enduring quietly under a sky the color of old stone. "But we have some," she said, "and some is enough to begin." In the spring of 1990, 4 months after his discharge from the hospital, Alexei Nikolayevich Liventsev began giving talks. Not public lectures, not organized events with printed programs and institutional sponsorship. Something more informal and more deliberate than that. Gatherings in apartments, in the back rooms of libraries, in the faculty lounges of universities whose more quietly curious professors had heard through the careful, word-of-mouth channels that a retired Soviet general had come back from clinical death with something worth listening to. The gatherings were small, 10 people, sometimes 15. Once, in a professor of philosophy's apartment on Vasilyevsky Island, 32 people sat on every available surface, including the floor and the windowsills, in complete silence for 2 hours, while a 67-year-old man with a damaged brain that should not have been working spoke without notes about what he had seen. Nobody recorded these talks. Nobody published transcripts. But people who were present at them described, consistently and independently, a particular quality to the experience, not the quality of being entertained or intellectually stimulated, but the quality of being recognized, of hearing something said aloud that they had known privately, but had never heard anyone say. This was in the last year of the Soviet Union, when the entire architecture of official certainty was visibly cracking, and people were reaching, hungrily and somewhat desperately, for frameworks to replace what was falling away. Into this particular historical moment, Liventsev brought not ideology, not politics, not a new system of collective salvation. He brought something more uncomfortable and more personal than any of those things. He brought a map and the instruction that each person in the room was responsible for reading it themselves. The final section of the notepads, the section that Liventsev himself considered the most important and the most difficult to convey without distortion, concerned not the structure of post-physical existence, but the history of the living. What he had been shown during his time in the memory field was not only the architecture of what comes after. He had been shown something about what came before, not in the personal biographical sense, but in the civilizational one. The presence had conveyed to him, in that state of total informational clarity, something that he described in the notepads as the pattern. He wrote, "I was not shown the future. I want to be entirely clear about this, because I know that what I am about to describe will be received as prophecy, and I am not a prophet and have no interest in being treated as one. What I was shown was a pattern, a historical pattern, observable across a span of civilizational time that far exceeds the written records available to human historians. A pattern that repeats, a pattern that, once seen, is recognizable in the current moment with a clarity that I find both intellectually compelling and personally distressing. The pattern was this: Every civilization that had reached a sufficient level of organizational and technological complexity had passed through the same sequence of phases. The sequence was not determined by geography or culture or the specific content of any civilization's belief systems. It was structural, the way the life cycle of a cell is structural, not dependent on the particular chemistry of any individual organism, but characteristic of the type. The first phase was what Liventsev called the period of questions, the founding era of a civilization, characterized by a genuine and widespread engagement with the deepest questions of existence. What are we? Why are we here? How should we live? What comes after? These questions, in the period of questions, were not rhetorical. They were the actual organizing preoccupation of the civilization's best minds and greatest energies. The answers developed were incomplete and culturally specific, but the questions themselves were taken seriously, and the seriousness with which they were taken produced, as a byproduct, a quality of human relationship and community that served as the civilization's connective tissue. The second phase was the period of building. The practical knowledge generated by the first phase, the mathematics, the astronomy, the understanding of natural systems that emerged from genuine philosophical inquiry, was applied to the material world. Cities, infrastructure, agricultural systems, technologies of communication and production. The civilization expanded its capacity to organize matter and energy in service of human purposes. This phase produced extraordinary achievements and also, almost invariably, began to generate a subtle but consequential shift in emphasis, away from the questions that had animated the first phase toward the answers that the second phase was producing. The questions began to feel less urgent. The achievements were visible and measurable. The questions were not. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, the balance tipped. The third phase Liventsev named the period of forgetting. Not forgetting in the sense of deliberate erasure. No civilization decided consciously to stop caring about the fundamental questions. The forgetting was structural. It happened through accumulation. The technologies of the second phase generated their own requirements. Maintenance, improvement, defense, expansion that absorbed the attention and resources of the civilization's most capable individuals. The questions did not disappear from the civilization's cultural inventory. They were preserved in texts, in rituals, in institutional forms that maintained their outer shape after the inner engagement had diminished. They became, over generations, objects of formal reverence rather than living inquiry. People continue to speak about the soul while treating it as irrelevant to the actual organization of their lives. They continue to perform the gestures of meaning-making while locating genuine meaning exclusively in the material domain. The disconnection was so gradual and so universally shared that it became invisible. It became the air. The fourth phase was the one that Liventsev wrote about with the most evident reluctance and the most careful precision. He called it the period of collapse, and he was careful, again, to specify that the collapse he was describing was not primarily political or economic or environmental, though it expressed itself through all of these. It was interior. The civilizations he had been shown did not fail because their enemies were stronger or their resources ran out or their organizational systems became too complex to manage, though all of these things occurred. They failed because the connective tissue had dissolved. The quality of human relationship that had been generated by the period of questions, the relationship of people who shared a genuine orientation toward the deepest questions, who saw each other as fellow travelers in a specific kind of inquiry. This quality, once lost, could not be reconstructed through institutional means alone. You could build laws, but you could not legislate the inner condition that makes laws unnecessary. You could build monuments, but you could not rebuild, through architecture, the quality of presence that the monuments were built to honor. The civilization continued to function, sometimes for a very long time, as an elaborate and increasingly brittle mechanism. And then, at some point that varied in its specific timing, but was in retrospect always identifiable as having been reached, the mechanism stopped. Liventsev wrote, I was shown not 2 or 3 civilizations in which this pattern operated. I was shown hundreds. I was shown this pattern operating across a span of human and pre-human history that makes what we call recorded history appear as a footnote. I was shown civilizations more technically sophisticated than ours that passed through this same sequence and did not survive it. I was shown civilizations that recognized the pattern early enough to interrupt it and that survived, but in forms that their period of building inhabitants would not have recognized as survival. Because what survived was not the mechanism, but the quality of interior engagement that the mechanism had been built to serve. I was shown, in other words, that the outcome is not predetermined. The pattern is consistent, but it has been interrupted. It can be interrupted. What interrupts it is not a discovery or a technology or a political reorganization. What interrupts it is individual human beings deciding, one at a time, to take the question seriously again. He wrote this in the spring of 1990. The Soviet Union had 8 months left to exist. The world that had organized human life for most of the 20th century was dissolving in real time. And in its dissolution, people everywhere were discovering that the systems they had lived inside had been providing, among their other functions, a substitute for the period of questions, an imposed answer to the question of meaning that, however inadequate, had at least relieved individuals of the obligation to find their own. The collapse of those systems left an emptiness that was not merely political or economic. It was existential. And into that emptiness, in the apartments and library back rooms of a city that had survived 900 days of siege precisely because its people had, somehow, maintained the inner quality that external catastrophe was designed to destroy. Into that emptiness, a man with a damaged brain and 11 notepads was saying, the emptiness is not the problem. The emptiness is the opportunity. The emptiness is the period of questions, trying to begin again. Maria spoke at some of these gatherings, sitting beside her husband, adding to his account the dimension he could not provide alone, the dimension of continuity of a life lived with the questions active rather than arrived at them suddenly. She spoke about Elena, carefully and without using her full name. She spoke about what 49 years of carrying an unexplained capacity had taught her about the relationship between inner honesty and outer perception, that the field showed her more clearly when she was clearer internally, and less clearly when she was frightened or proud or invested in a particular outcome. She spoke about the 3 surgeries and what she had followed and why she had been right. She spoke, toward the end of these gatherings, about what she believed was required of the people in the room. Not conversion to a new belief system, not the adoption of a specific spiritual practice, not anything that required organizational membership or institutional loyalty. She said, what is required is honesty. Begin there. An honest daily accounting with yourself. Not the performance of virtue, not the management of how you appear, but the actual question asked in actual privacy. What am I doing, and why am I doing it? And is the reason I'm doing it one I can stand in? She said, this is not comfortable. Comfort is not the point. The point is accuracy. And accuracy, over time, changes the quality of what you're becoming, which, as my husband has explained, is the only thing that matters in the end. Liventsev lived for 6 more years after his awakening. He died in January of 1996, at 72 years old, in the apartment on Bolshaya Morskaya Street, in the chair by the window. His daughter Natasha was with him. Maria was in the next room. He did not die dramatically. He died the way a man dies when he has finished what he came back to do, not with resignation, not with reluctance, but with the particular completeness of a task that has been carried to its natural end. Natasha said he turned his head toward the window sharply, as though someone had called his name from outside. She said his expression in the final seconds was not fear. It was recognition. His last words were spoken clearly and without effort, in the same measured voice he had always used, the voice of a man stating a fact. It is already too late now. Not too late for him. He had done what he came back to do. The notepads existed. The conversations had been had. The people who had sat on the floors and windowsills of apartments across Leningrad had carried what they heard back into their own lives and, in some cases, forward into the lives of others. The account was in the world. The map had been drawn. Too late, perhaps, in a different sense. Too late to pretend that the questions don't exist. Too late to continue inhabiting, without examination, the comfortable fiction that what we do with the time we have does not matter, that what we become in the process of living does not accumulate, that the interior life, the actual, private, unperformed interior life, the one that exists before the audience and after it is gone, is not the thing we carry with us when everything else falls away. Too late for the particular luxury of unreflective living that the period of forgetting had made available. Too late, in other words, for the sleep. The information was in the world now. And information, once genuinely received, cannot be unreceived. Maria Ilyinichna Liventseva outlived her husband by 14 years. She died in 2010 at the age of 75 in the same apartment, with Natasha beside her and the wooden box of Elena's letters still behind the winter coats in the wardrobe. In the weeks before her death, when she was strong enough to speak but had largely ceased to leave her bed, she returned repeatedly to a single theme in her conversations with her daughter. Not the cosmology, not the three conditions or the memory field or the conductor. Something more immediate and more personal than any of that. She returned to the question of what it meant to have been given, not through a coma or a crisis, but through the ordinary accumulation of 49 years of quiet, honest observation, access to a dimension of reality that most people around her have been unable or unwilling to perceive. What had cost? What had been worth? Whether the cost had been proportionate to the worth. She told Natasha, in one of these conversations recorded in Natasha's journal in November of 2010, I used to think that the hardest thing was the silence, carrying what I knew and not being able to say it. But I understand now that the silence was not the cost. The silence was the practice. What I was learning in all those years of not speaking was the difference between knowing something and being something. You can know a great deal and be very little. The knowledge passes through you and leaves no mark, the way water passes through a pipe without changing the pipe. What changes you is the honesty you apply to what you know, the willingness to let it land, to let it ask something of you, to be different because of what you have seen rather than merely informed. She paused. Her breathing was slow and very even. That is what your father brought back. Not information, an invitation. An invitation to let what is true about the deepest things ask something real of you. Another pause. Whether people accept the invitation is not something either of us could control. We could only extend it. Natasha wrote in her journal that night, "My mother died this morning at 4:47. She was completely calm. Her last expression was one I recognized from a single other face, one other time, my father's face in January of 1996 in the chair by the window. Recognition, complete and quiet recognition, as though the thing she had known for a very long time had finally come to meet her openly. Outside the window, the city that had once been Leningrad, the city of the 900-day siege, the city of the kitchen table and 11 notepads and the wooden box of letters and 49 years of silence finally broken, was doing what it always did in November, enduring, under a sky the color of old stone, in the cold that the city had learned to live inside so completely that it had become not a hardship but a quality of character. Enduring and continuing and asking, as it had always asked, as the period of questions always asks, in every civilization that has ever stood at the edge of the pattern and chosen, however briefly and however imperfectly, to interrupt it, asking the only question that has ever mattered. Who are you, in the time that remains, going to become? The notepads are still in existence. They are kept by Natasha, now in her 60s, in a city that has changed its name and changed its government and changed its certainties several times in the decades since her father came back from wherever he had been and asked for paper. They're not published. They're not archived. They exist in a canvas bag on a shelf, in the handwriting of a military scientist who chose, when offered the alternative, to return, who chose to come back and draw the map and extend the invitation, and then, when his time was finished, to leave again, through the same door toward the same recognition, with the same quiet completeness with which he had done everything else in a life that had survived the siege and the stroke and a knowledge of what actually waits at the end of what we insist on calling the end. Maria called it the beginning. If something in this account resonates with a knowledge you already carry but have had no framework for, if any of this touches something you recognize from the inside out, something that is not belief, but something more stubborn and more private than belief, then you already understand what Liventsev spent 6 years trying to explain. You already know what Maria spent 49 years carrying in silence. You already have access to the conductor, whether or not you have called it by that name. The question is not whether the knowledge is real. The question is whether you are willing to let it ask something of you. Right, if you feel it, those 3 words, I'm still alive. Not as a gesture, not as a comment for an algorithm to count, as a statement of intent, a declaration that the period of questions is not over for you, that the map has been received, that the invitation has been accepted, that you are here in the time you have with the full knowledge of what that time is for, and that you have chosen, as Liventsev chose in the silence of the memory field, to use it